Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Tony Funk here, yet again with another manga analysis. This time on Okita Yoshihitsu's very own Jisatsu Houjo. Now, before I even begin by giving y'all a quick rundown, I must add that this is an ongoing manga currently consisting of 2 volumes. Now, I debated whether or not it would have been appropriate to even give an analysis on a manga that hasn't concluded yet, especially one in the mystery genre, where we are yet to have the complete puzzle pieces to accurately extrapolate Okita Yoshihitsu's intended themes and intentions. So because it would be premature for me to even give you a plot analysis, I will be analyzing the setup of the plot. But wait, Tony, why are you choosing to give us an analysis of an incomplete story? So, let me explain. I went into this manga thinking I could create a Halloween-themed review a few days ago and give you guys a little festive treat. However, as soon as I finished reading both volumes, I found myself with a pantheon of incomplete ideas, underdeveloped themes, and the potential to touch on so many different topics. So I held off on that Halloween review and decided to explore the profound world-building concepts that permeate into our real world and transcend the idea that Jisatsu Houjo is just a horror mystery manga designed to give us a suspenseful fright, and rather that this manga is an exploration of the different forces of mental illness that manifest themselves as the Shinigami. Though this type of analysis on this type of a manga would seem like a no-brainer, it did lead me down the rabbit hole of understanding one of Japan's most famous folk characters, and made me realize that this particular folk belief is flexible and not completely subservient to the Buddhist concepts, or Shinto concepts for that matter, that came before it, but instead is directly connected to the public conscious of Japanese society. Here we will explore what differentiates the Shinigami from other Japanese beliefs, and how the Shinigami is a litmus test that helps us understand Japanese attitudes, particularly over death and suicide, by examining the ever-changing traits of this so-called death god. So having said all of that, before we explore the 2 renditions of the Shinigami that are present in this manga, there's a traditional version and a modern version, let's first take a look at how they are set up within the confines of the story, which can be found pretty much entirely within the first chapter of Jisatsu Houjo. So there are going to be some spoilers, obviously, so do keep that in mind if you want to read the whole manga, spoiler free. Jisatsu Houjo opens up with her main character, second-year university student Otome, wandering through a graveyard surrounded by demons until he reaches a large tree with a noose while surrounded by them. The demons seem to be egging Otome to hang himself, and Otome subsequently does, when one demon cryptically tells him the words, "Neck, hang it." Otome immediately wakes up from his nightmares, stating that it had happened again, and we begin to get exposition from her story. Otome, being a university student, is found staying at a 39-year-old wooden apartment building in room 203 in the city of Gonko. Despite the apartment being creepy, which later we find out is the cause of his nightmares, Otome stays due to its proximity to the university and its economic price point. We later cut to Otome attending university and seeing his friends at the Folklore Studies Association. Here we meet his concerned and loyal friend Ojo, his callous but supportive friend Morihiko, and his studious and stoic friend Kaga. His friends seem to be concerned about their inability to contact Otome, which Otome brushes off. Here we also learn that Morihiko is working as a photographer for a photo studio, which comes into play later in the story. We also get some more setup for later things to come, as our introduction to Kaga seems to arise from an unorthodox situation and raises a lot of questions. You see, Kaga is introduced as a folklore bookworm who's trapped underneath a bookshelf, which none of our main characters are able to lift off of her except Ojo, who's conveniently carrying an electric winch that can pull up to 264 pounds. Kind of an odd thing for a student to just carry around, I guess. But it does come into play later. I won't spoil that part though. We get an off-screen moment where she uses said winch to lift the bookshelf off of Kaga, and we immediately change focus to Otome's physical state, who is uncharacteristically thinner than usual. Here we learn that Otome has lost weight due to being sleep deprived from his recurring nightmare about hanging himself amidst the demons. Otome's physical condition is likened to that of hungry demons, a Buddhist concept that arises from the belief that people who had lived a life of self-service suffer a fate of going down the demon path. This belief, of course, is an element of Buddhism's 6 paths of rebirth. Later, Morihiko finds out via text message that someone was found hanged behind the local high school in the woods. This leads Morihiko to egg Otome on to explore and get a picture of the body. We are later revealed by Otome that this is the 3rd hanging within a year's time. We get some exposition that the hanging was most likely a murder due to the condition of the body being more consistent with strangulation than with a hanging. Not only that, but we are also revealed that there had been a total of 6 hangings within the last 2 years. Because of the statistical anomalies of such a high number of hangings, rumors had been circulating around the town that they were most likely all murders caused by a supernatural entity called the Suicide Maiden. The Maiden is explained to be a woman who appears in front of those wishing to commit suicide and provides them the knowledge necessary to kill themselves in a proper and painless way. However, if she is ever implored to help, she makes those who work with her sign a contract that if they do not kill themselves within 30 days, she will assist in their suicide. Later, Otome joins Morihiko to the side of the dead body and picks up a strange sweet odor among the crowd that had gathered by. Otome recognizes the scent as being one similar to the scent he'd smell in his suicide dream. He also notices a red envelope that had fallen beneath the hanging corpse. Later, Otome, troubled by the suicides and his dreams, receives counsel from Kaga, where she conjectures that his dreams are related to the building in which Otome is staying in, due to the rhythmic cracking of the old expanding and contracting wood. She also conjectures that Otome might be possessed by a demon that's giving him these recurring nightmares. This becomes prophetic as later that night, Otome falls asleep and begins to have a nightmare. Only that this nightmare has a lucidity to it unlike his previous nightmares. In the midst of it, Otome opens his eyes only to see the same body of the girl who hung herself earlier that day, hanging from his ceiling. He notices her bloodied face as he begins to hear the same words as he did in his dream. Neck. Hang it. Otome understandably freaks out and runs outside to rinse his face with an outdoor faucet, telling himself, it's only a dream, when in an instant he goes into a trance and is seemingly possessed as he continues to hear, neck, hang it. Now in a trance-like state, Otome heads to a nearby tree, presumably the same one where the girl was found, and finds a conveniently placed jump rope hanging from one of its branches, and a conveniently placed stool to stand on. As Otome prepares to hang himself, he repeats to himself that he must hang himself for he had committed a sin, when a voice behind him interrupts him asking, "Are you planning to die now?" Startled, Otome knocks the stool over, causing his neck to hang from the jump rope as he gasps for air before the jump rope snaps and Otome falls to the ground. The mysterious voice reveals herself as the Suicide Maiden, as Otome asks her for help. She offers to help, but unbeknownst to him, pricks Otome's finger and collects a dollop of blood, from which she uses to sign Otome's suicide contract off-screen. She casually explains to Otome that hanging using a jump rope is not the best way to go about suicide, and explains that she is the one who can provide Otome with a proper and painless suicide, explaining to him a proper way to hang himself. The chapter ends with Otome realizing that he is now at the whim of 2 competing supernatural entities, the hungry demons who are responsible for his dreams and his possession, as well as the Suicide Maiden, as he states that he is now in the hands of 2 gods of death. Alrighty, now that we got the setup of this story out of the way, let's examine the origins and importance of these 2 gods of death. The central conflict of the story revolves around the apparent power struggle of 2 Shinigami. Though I'm sure many of you guys are already familiar with the concept of the Shinigami, there are many nuances about this Japanese type of entity. So first let's break down the many facets of the Shinigami. The concept of the Shinigami appears to be a relatively new concept, believe it or not. However, before we delve into the role of the Shinigami, we must first look at the origins of the Shinigami. Since Buddhism was one of the major influences of Japanese culture, folklore, and mysticism, we must examine the Buddhist precursor of the Shinigami, known as Mara. Mara has an equivalent in Hinduism, which we know has many similarities to Buddhism. This equivalent is known as the Mritu Mara, by which the Buddhist Mara was based off of. But going back to Mara, Mara is an entity which originally was described as the demon that tempted Buddha to stray from enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Several years after Buddha's death, Mara was described in more detail in the religious text called the Samyutta Nikaya, where Mara is depicted as a Satan-like entity who likes to tempt both Buddha and his disciples. Not only is Mara depicted as a physical entity, but it is also acknowledged as a psychological state of being as well. Because Mara is the antithesis of enlightenment, it is also represented as the conglomeration of one's own vices that steer someone away from enlightenment. This includes selfishness, sexual gratification, violence, and passion. Pretty much all the shit that the Jedi Order condemns. The reason why I bring up the predecessor of the Shinigami is because of the connection Mara has to the hungry demons being depicted in Jisatsu Houjo. These hungry demons are obviously based off of the hungry ghosts, as they're called in Buddhism. Similar to how Mara is a representation of selfishness and immoral desires, the hungry ghosts are also representative of those traits. You see, though there are death Maras, and though they are technically death gods, the belief that they share the Shinigami's niche as gods who lure one to death through suicide is actually either overstated or completely fabricated. I tried looking for more sources that substantiated the connection between Mara's enticement of suicide and the Shinigami's enticement of suicide. However, I was unable to find anything in English where I could, substantiate these claims. It isn't until the Edo period in Japan when the concept of the Shinigami as we know it comes to life. We get our first mention of it in 1706 in a play, and a more definitive version of the Shinigami in 1841. You see, despite the fact that it had been 225 years since Japan was closed off to the rest of the world, we see that Western concepts of death had permeated into Japanese society. For some reference on the influence of Western ideas in Japanese culture, Japan even had Catholic daimyos in the 1550s, up until the early 1600s. And daimyos Omura Somitada and his son Omura Yoshiaki, as well as many more afterwards. Christianity was so big in the 1610s that the majority of Nagasaki's residents were actually Christian. Now, the reason why it is theorized that Western influence, such as Christianity, had an influence on the Edo period rendition of the Shinigami, is because Christianity introduced the concept of a personification of death found throughout the Bible, such as in Revelation 6:8. Since such an introduction affected the beliefs and customs of Japanese aristocracy, and since Christianity became illegal to practice due to the fear of an Iberian invasion, Christian elements had to be changed and merged with Japanese culture and beliefs in order to stay under the radar and not be singled out. The one element that stood out to be more uniquely Japanese, however, was the fact that instead of being supernatural beings that fulfill a specific function, such as the Grim Reaper's duty to take souls to the afterlife, the Shinigami act more so as intercessors, more in line with the Buddhist Mara equivalents. This makes them more akin to demons, ghosts, or poltergeists, depending on their depiction. Now, having established that though the Shinigami aren't traditional Japanese religious beliefs, their introduction revolutionized attitudes towards death in Japan. In the Shizuoka Prefecture, for example, there is the belief of a Shinigami that lures people to sites of past deaths and imprisons them unless they can provide a person to die in that same area. Though many Edo period stories describe the exploits of the Shinigami, none describe the plot of Jisatsu Houjo as closely as the short story found in Ehon Hyaku Monogatari from 1841. This story follows a spirit of a deceased person who did bad deeds, who's forced to lead new people into suicide through possession. Now, it doesn't take much now for us to identify Otome's nightmare and subsequent possession for this Edo period depiction of the Shinigami. We could assume, then, that the first death god that afflicts Otome is the Edo period rendition of this Shinigami. So now we have to take a look at the more modern rendition of the Shinigami, which is the Suicide Maiden. In order to get into the origins of the Suicide Maiden, and later the cultural influences that created this template for this entity, we will be getting into spoiler territory. And by that I mean past Chapter 1. Okay, so in Chapter 11, Volume 2, we find out that the Suicide Maiden, also known as Hirasaka Koyomi, belongs to the bloodline of the Mayoi family, who were cursed by having their female descendants unable to die. The reason for their curse is a lot more profound in the scheme of Japanese culture regarding suicide. According to legend, the Mayoi family consisted of fortune tellers who became wealthy through divination. As their enterprise grew, they expanded into new ventures such as investing in a stationery, as well as trade with the outside world in order to develop the town of Gonko as an important port city. Because of the family's newfound wealth within the trade industry, they began to amass information in the form of foreign books, where they ran into the Western concept of euthanasia. Being in a time when seppuku was considered a thing of the past, information regarding euthanasia or peaceful suicide became sought out. Since the slow decline of Bushido code following the end of the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese steered away from the death with honor concept of seppuku, ritual disembowelment, but continued to hold the cultural belief that it is better to die before causing dissonance with the expectations of society. This bourgeoisie cultural makeup made information regarding euthanasia very popular amongst the public, and allowed such information to become lucrative. The selling of suicide secrets became problematic for two reasons. The first being that the Mayoi were now responsible for facilitating suicide to an even larger public audience. The second reason being that they were profiting off of the dead, instead of providing a public service of ethical euthanasia. In typical Shinigami folk fashion, selfish deeds such as profiting from indirectly killing people would lead to the hungry ghost realm of Buddhism, where one is reincarnated at the end of their human realm, and are cursed to be immortal until their bad karma runs out. In Jisatsu Houjo, the penalty for such an infraction is the curse of immortality, but not invulnerability for the female descendants of the Mayoi family. This in turn caused the ostracization of the entire family, and thus the end of their practices in dealing information on assisted suicide. Now it's curious to know that we have a depiction of a Shinigami associated with the Edo period in Japan approximately from the 1840s, and a depiction of a Shinigami influenced by Buddhism, as well as post-Meiji Restoration ideas, particularly Showa and Heisei ideals of pragmatist Bushido. Allow me to read an excerpt from Onuki Tierney and Amiko's anthropologic study on Japanese attitudes towards illness and suicide. And I quote, "The attitude toward cancer among the Japanese is especially intriguing because of their well-known bravery in facing other forms of death, as evidenced by kamikaze pilots who made the suicidal plunge into American battleships during the final phase of World War II. It is said that every single member of the 201st Air Group stationed in the Philippines volunteered for the kamikaze units. An ideological system in Japan idealizes certain types of suicide, although actual suicides are based on many different motivations, attitudes, and circumstances, and even culturally sanctioned suicides may not be carried out with an idealized attitude on the part of the individuals involved. Indeed, few other cultures sanction and even extol the beauty of voluntary death to the extent to which the Japanese culture does. One can actually classify the types of suicide that are condoned and even romanticized in Japan. A few examples will suffice for illustration. Seppuku, mentioned above, was considered the only way a samurai warrior during the feudal period could end his life in honor under certain circumstances. It entails stabbing across his own lower abdomen, while the person closest to him beheads him in order to hasten the process of dying. Shinju, written in characters that mean the inside of the heart, is a term used for double suicide, committed primarily by lovers who could not marry because of legal or social disapproval. For example, during the feudal period, the law prohibited marriage between members of different castes. Two individuals from different castes who fell in love then chose the route of double suicide, a recurrent theme in the traditional kabuki and bunraku theater. Contemporary versions of these two categories of suicide also abound. The kamikaze units toward the end of World War II represent a collective seppuku by contemporary warriors. During the same period, soldiers also committed gyokusai, which is written with characters that mean to scatter like a crystal ball. This was also collective suicide committed by Japanese soldiers who killed themselves rather than endure the shame of surrendering to the enemy. This notion of suicide is reinforced in contemporary Japan through such cultural institutions as theater, television, and novels, which presented romanticized views of suicide to the Japanese public. In addition, Japanese young people frequently go on school trips to various historic sites and scenic spots, where a guide might point out to them a certain pine tree where such and such lovers committed suicide, or a volcano that is known for the lovers who have jumped into it. Although young people may not take the idea of suicide itself, the romantic air surrounding the act is impressed upon them. The Japanese attitude towards suicide is quite alien to Americans, among whom suicide is often but not always considered proof that the individual was suffering from mental illness. In fact, suicide is so taboo in the United States that when the cause of death is not included in an obituary, people suspect suicide. End quote. Okay, so because of this romanticization of suicide present in Japanese contemporary culture, we can see the Suicide Maiden has adapted the Shinigami role and modernized to reflect suicide culture in modern Japanese society. The greatest example of this being a modern adaptation of its Edo counterpart is the rampant association of high schoolers and college students with suicide. It should come with no surprise that the suicides depicted in the tree in the town of Gonko are inspired by the real-world phenomenon of the Aokigahara suicides. And you see, Japan has had a steady incline in student suicides, with 415 suicides recorded among students aged 6 to 18 in just the year 2020. So we can see how the Shinigami is still a relevant folk character in Japanese society, now catering more to, air quotes, modern suicide methods. Now, from my research, I found that there is another, much more sinister reason as to why the Shinigami continues to be romanticized as a being that coaxes one to take their life, and it has to do with excusing the stigma of mental health in Japan, which continues to be very prevalent. One study conducted by the Japanese Society of Psychiatry and Neurology found that nearly 2/3 of Japanese people suffering from CMDs, or common mental disorders, never seek professional help. As terrible as this statistic sounds, I wanted to get to the bottom of this and figure out where Japanese stigmatization came from in a cross-sectional international study to get a better idea if these levels of underreporting and stigmatization were common. I found that not only did the public stigmatize mental health more in Japan than in Western nations such as Australia, but that also mental health centers in Japan used less sophisticated treatments due to understaffing. One study published by the Epidemiology and Psychiatric Sciences Journal under Professor of Psychiatry Toshio Hasegawa found that Japanese patients were nearly 270 times as likely to be physically restrained during treatment as American patients, 600 times as likely as Australians, and 3,200 times as likely as New Zealanders. What the fuck? So no wonder mental health is such a staggering issue in Japan, especially if treatment is so primitive. But now let's look at the public opinion of mental health within Japanese society to later look at the cause for such attitudes from a historic and cultural perspective. According to an internet-based survey from Japan, 48 to 61% of people would not employ someone with schizophrenia, 54 to 58% of people would not vote for a politician with depression, and 40% of the public regarded dementia as a shameful condition. So what's causing all of these seemingly prejudiced beliefs? Well, from what I could gather from a Japanese study on mental health-related stigma from the Psychiatry and Clinical Neurosciences Organization, found that the cultural elements of hone and tatemae contribute to the social rejection of those who do not conform to societal expectations. Let me explain. Hone refers to one's true feelings about a topic that can either only be expressed behind closed doors or not at all, whereas tatemae is the publicly agreed opinion which is to be expressed when in public. This dichotomy of different methods of expression causes Japanese society to fear standing out and expressing their own thoughts if they go against the concept of tatemae. This perpetuates the idea stemmed from Buddhist tradition that mental illness is a form of Mara, an inability to stave off one's mental demons that cause deviant behavior such as self-destruction and the pursuit of one's own passion. It's no surprise then that in multiple surveys it was found that the Japanese see mental health as being caused more by weakness of character than by biological markers, such as genetic predisposition. The general public, as a result, generally sees mental illness as part of someone's own fault as opposed to external factors. If the Mara in Buddhism are psychological forces that cause us to stray from mental fortitude and enlightenment, then there's going to be a perpetuating public opinion that mental health problems stem from one's inability to reach enlightenment. Yikes. Japan is not the only place, however, that stigmatizes mental health disorders. We see it in Western countries as well. But the reasons for Japanese stigmatization seem to carry a more ancient connection, which has morphed from the Buddhist Mara into the Edo period's folk stories revolving around the Shinigami, who lure one to commit suicide and doom one from ever reaching enlightenment. I think it's curious to note that Jisatsu Houjo's Suicide Maiden represented the Shinigami as a merciful entity, one that would offer the easiest way out through a painless death. We learn throughout the manga that the Suicide Maiden's intentions are good, and her ethos is diametrically opposed to that of the hungry ghost Shinigamis that only want to possess you and cause you to kill yourself at whatever cost. It's curious to note that in contrast to the West's interpretation of a good spirit, instead of the Suicide Maiden's goal being to prevent suicide from the mentally disturbed, her role as a hero lies in ensuring that one dies an honorable death through a painless suicide. And so, the legend of the Shinigami continues to provide us with windows into the Japanese cultural attitudes towards mental health and their perceptions of honorable suicide that are so diametrically opposed to the West's ideas. In the West, murder is easy to depict on TV, but suicide is always a taboo and makes us recoil, whereas Japan has found virtue in fearless self-destruction. In this tale of good versus evil, it's interesting to note that life is not an optional escape in this conflict between the two Shinigami affecting Otome and the town of Gonko, but rather the type of death that defines the heroic entity. It should be no surprise then that in this modern take of the benevolent Shinigami, Jisatsu Houjo, when translated to English, means assisted suicide. Thanks guys very much for joining me on this Tony Funkumentary. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. There are a lot of more concepts that I didn't touch, but I didn't want to spoil the entire story of the manga. And so yeah, I encourage you guys to check out the manga if you liked this video, and let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Anyway guys, thank you very much once again, and I'll see yous down the road.